everyone. Is it okay if I sit? Yeah, we want to check in with audience comfort. Is it okay if we sit down? There's pretty good sight lines. Cool. Thank you all so much for being here. My name is Jordy Silverstein and I'm part of the committee of the Australian Jewish Democratic Society, the organisation that has put on today. And I just want to start by acknowledging that we're on the land of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, to acknowledge that sovereignty has never been ceded, and to pay my respects to elders past and present. And we make that acknowledgement, as I'm sure you all know, not just because that's the thing you do at an event, but to take seriously the question of what it means for those of us who are not Indigenous to walk on Aboriginal land. To think about what solidarity means in these contexts, to think about the fact that this is unceded Wurundjeri and Kulin territory, and so that's a large part of what we're thinking about here today. So we acknowledge that we're on the lands of the Wurundjeri people. I guess I also want to note that it's NAIDOC week at the moment, and in many ways it's a coincidence that this is happening during NAIDOC week, but I feel like it's important to acknowledge this is NAIDOC week, and that NAIDOC week is about celebrating Aboriginal people and Aboriginal continuity, resistance, and life. And it's a political week that I think it's important for Aboriginal people to sit back and support. So, we're very excited to have Orly with us on this speaking tour, and this is Orly's first big event of her speaking tour. Orly arrived in Australia 24 hours ago, 30 hours ago, but apparently is not beleaguered by jet lag. So we hope that continues to be true throughout the event. So I'll just give a bit of an outline of how the event's going to go, and then we'll get into it. So we're here to learn and to think together, to try out ideas, to be challenged, to be open to challenge, to be open to speaking new words and hearing new words, and thinking deeply. So Orly's going to speak for about 10 minutes, and then each of our wonderful people on our panel is going to respond for a few minutes, and I'll give you bios for all of them in a minute. And then we're going to chat a bit amongst ourselves for 10 or so minutes and open up some questions. And then what we're going to do is we will move to the space for all of you to ask questions. But what we're going to do before you ask questions, and I want you to be thinking, while we're talking, think about what sort of questions you want to be asking. And we're going to take 5 minutes after we've had a bit of a talk, so we get a little bit of a break, and you can all turn to the person next to you and workshop that question that you're thinking about. So think about what is it you actually want to ask. Maybe if you're not sure if you want to ask a question, have a think about what you could ask. Just as a way of kind of distilling what your questions are and what you're thinking about. And then we'll come back and we'll ask questions and we'll see how we go. So I hope that sounds good to you. And I'll now, maybe I'll just read out all your bios now, so then it's done and then we can get into it. And you can stop hearing from me. So, Orly is a Mizrahi. Mizrahi means a Jew from Middle Eastern countries. Orly is a Mizrahi journalist and activist who's over here on a speaking tour organised by the Australian Jewish Democratic Society, or the AJDS. This year she was one of 50 prominent Mizrahi Jews in Israel who filed a petition to the Israeli High Court of Justice against the nation-state law, stating that it erases their cultural legacy and perpetuates injustices against both them and Palestinian citizens of Israel. Next up in our line we have Micaela Sahhar. Micaela is an Australian Palestinian researcher and writer. She holds a doctorate from the University of Melbourne, and her research interests include narrative appropriation, comparative settler colonialism, and questions of identity in settler societies. And next to Micaela we have Fatima Mawas, who is a filmmaker and writer who has been active in Indigenous solidarity and decolonisation work in Muslim and Arab communities. She's involved in Muslims Say No to Invasion Day and produced a short video about Invasion Day in Arabic. And finally, we have Crystal McKinnon, who is a Yamatji woman who lives and works on Kulin country, and she's a Vice Chancellor's Indigenous Research Fellow at RMIT. So please join me in welcoming them all. And here's Orly.
Thank you very much, Jordy. Well, thank you all for coming. I know that, well, for me at least, this title, settler colonialism, is such an abstract one that in order to talk about it, I want to take you all to a very concrete moment. The 24th of March 2006. Two Palestinian residents of the Palestinian city of Hebron in the occupied West Bank woke up to the Israeli military checkpost that is positioned there, stabbing one of the soldiers. They were shot by the Israeli soldiers that were there. One of them died immediately. The other, Abdel Fattah Sharif, he fell on the ground bleeding, by the way, for a quite period of time without getting any medical treatment, although a military ambulance was just around the corner. And after about 4 or 5 minutes that he was dying slowly, bleeding to death, an Israeli soldier by the name of El Azaria shot him dead, basically executed him. And following that, when that was published, eventually El Azaria became a sort of a popular hero in Israel, so much so that in the previous elections that we've had a few months ago, he was actually the star of the political campaign of one of the Likud parliament members, and the Likud party is the biggest party of Prime Minister Netanyahu. So this moment of the lethal encounter between El Azaria and Abdel Fattah Sharif at that checkpoint in Hebron, for me it embodies, in a very both symbolic and concrete way, the meaning of settler colonial reality in Israel and Palestine. First off, because Hebron, probably more than any place else in the occupied territory, embodies the apartheid that the Israeli occupation turned out to be. It's not just, well, in all the West Bank, of course, you have two sets of law officially, two sets of law for the two different populations living there, the Palestinian residents and the Israeli settlers, who are the citizens of the state of Israel. So it means that if a Palestinian and an Israeli are smoking pot together anywhere in the West Bank, they will be facing two different law systems and probably will be facing very, very different punishments. I mean, the Israeli one would probably walk free and the Palestinian one would sit in jail. That's the meaning of proper apartheid. The apartheid in Hebron also means that there is a physical separation inside the city itself, so that, for example, the Shohada Street, the main street, which used to be the main commercial center, the Palestinian commercial center of Hebron, is locked to any Palestinian movement. It means that they are not allowed to be present in what used to be the main street of the city. And this, by the way, happened, this prohibition, after the massacre of the Palestinian worshippers in Hebron. So they were actually punished for an Israeli settler committing this horrifying crime. Now, in Orly, the soldier who executed the Sharif is a Mizrahi Jew. The Mizrahis in Israel are the Jews that immigrated to Israel from Muslim and Arab countries. And I'm mentioning his ethnicity because I think that this adds a whole new layer of complexity to this moment of encounter between him and the Palestinian that was shot dead for trying to resist the occupation of his land. In that sense, ethnicity matters because Orly, being the descendant of a Mizrahi family, coming from a Mizrahi family, presents both the tragedy of Mizrahim, of Jews from Arab and Muslim countries in Israel, but also potential for a possibility at least, for a different encounter and different reality that does not, outside the colonial frame. Now, but he's also the Mizrahi tragedy because he embodies the way that the Mizrahim once brought to Israel in the early 1950s were incorporated into the colonial Zionist project with when Israel brought the Jewish communities that for different reasons was very difficult for them to remain in their home states after the establishment of Israel, they were not so much welcome in Israel because they were Arabs. I mean, a Jew that grew up in Iraq and was part of the Communist Party, the Iraqi Communist Party, as many Jews were in Iraq, and this is just one example. He was an Arab, a Jewish Arab, but nonetheless a full Arab. His culture was he shared the Arabic culture, his history, language, of course, and his frame of reference was the Arab world. So when Israel brought the Mizrahim to Israel, it did so very suspiciously, offering the Mizrahim the following deal. We, the Zionist enterprise, see ourselves, and that was actually the phrase used very often by Zionist leaders, including Ehud Barak. He loves that metaphor of a villa in the jungle. Yeah, Zionism saw itself as, and may I add, a white villa in the jungle, a very European-oriented villa in the jungle. And so we bring you, the Mizrahi Jews, because you are Jews and because that's the raison d'etre of the state of Israel, so we have no choice but to let you in. So you can step into the villa from outside the jungle, of course. I mean, we look at you still very suspiciously. You can walk in. But then you need to constantly prove to us that you are the right kind of Arab and not the wrong kind of Arab, which we live outside the walls of this white villa in the jungle. How do you prove that to us? First of all, you have to get rid of any hint of Arabhood or Arabness in your identity. So now, 3 generations later, less than 1% of the Mizrahi kids know how to speak Arabic. And if they do speak Arabic, it's because they learned it in the military so that they can dress up as Arabs and invade the Arab cities without being recognized as soldiers. Like, we have a word for that in Hebrew. Pretending to be. So now they are like reacquiring the Arab identity as a mask in the use of this colonial project at the heart of the Middle East, where they are originally a part of. So you need to get rid of any sign of Arab group. Give me 2 minutes warning before because I can just keep it
Keep going, please.
And you need to constantly prove to us that you are it's not just that you are not Arab, you're not practicing your Arabic identity or Arab identity. You need to be very active in the way that you're rejecting that identity. You need to be more alienated to the Arab environment than any of us. You need to be more patriotic than any of us in the Zionist sense. I don't think that I'm any less patriotic than anybody, but in the Zionist sense, which its most immediate meaning is really hating Arabs. That's what being a proper Zionist patriot is today in Israel. So with that in mind, I want to go back to that moment at that checkpoint in Hebron and think about what an encounter between El Azaria's grandparents, I think they come from Morocco, I'm not sure, it might be one of the other countries, I think it's Morocco. What would an encounter like that with a Palestinian in this area of the greater Middle East look like 100 years ago, outside the frames of Zionism, outside the frames of the settler colonial? So less than a century ago, it was very possible for him to meet a fellow Palestinian, a fellow Middle Eastern, speak Arabic with him, which he cannot do today, share a mutual culture which he cannot do today anymore. And the most important thing, he wasn't a superior. He wasn't locked up in these walls of this white villa, and he had actually access to the environment in which his entire heritage comes from, and from which he's denied today because the choice that was imposed wasn't really a choice, because of this reality that was imposed on the Mizrahi communities. Now, we must admit, without a doubt, Zionism, as was implemented in the state of Israel for 70 years, is a European colonial project. Having said that, we are now today, 70 years later, facing a reality in which new generations of Jewish Israelis were born and raised in that state, therefore creating a new semi-indigenous nationality identity within the context of settler colonialism, which makes it so much harder to unfold or to solve, because these are lots of layers of reality that cannot be ignored. It won't do us any use saying, oh, Jews should go back to wherever they came from. I grew up in Iran, I cannot go back to Iran today. Yeah, it's not realistic to say that today. But we do, and we can and we must think about other possibilities that will allow us to break down the walls of this villa in the jungle, because we cannot keep, because as long as these walls are there, we are living a settler colonial reality. And the way out of these walls is exactly an Or Azaria in its other possible reality of Mizrahi awareness as a political option, to prefer the possibility of connection to the greater Middle East, the area in which we are part of, see ourselves as natives of this area, but that of course requires giving up all the tremendous privileges that come with being part of the residents of the villa. Even though the Mizrahis would never, I mean, the most that we can do, for 70 years we've had a woman prime minister. We've never had a Mizrahi prime minister, and we never will, because the most that the Zionist project can offer Mizrahim is that if you try really, really hard and you lose all your heritage and all your history and culture and language, is maybe we will allow you to be promoted from the cellar to the kitchen, let's say. But never beyond that, and I could talk for hours showing you exactly one by one Mizrahi politicians who almost made it and then were strike down. Nobody, of course, says explicitly that it's because of their Mizrahi identity, but it just works. Racism rarely expresses itself officially in these terms. 2 minutes. So the petition that Jordy mentioned was part of, we are very few. I must admit that I hardly represent like it's less than 1% of the Mizrahim today, because power is an intoxicating thing, and it's very tempting to be part of the powerful majority. But I think that there is a group of us still keeping the Mizrahi option on the table alive as a different possibility to reconcile the Mizrahi tragedy that was created throughout 70 years within the Zionist colonial project, and just at least if even if it doesn't seem very realistic today, keep it as an option for a new view on the Middle East and on the shared land, and how we can decolonialize ourselves. And it must be done again outside the Zionist frame. But I think that giving away privileges in return for your dignity as a human being and your heritage and the ability to really be someone, and for it to mean something, that you come from this region, that we are part of the region, and that we share not only the environment, but in its widest sense. I think it's a pretty good deal, but we still have a lot of convincing to do.
Thank you so much, Orly. I'll just hand it straight to Micaela.
Thanks, Orly. I really appreciated the concreteness of how you were talking, and also, I guess, talking about Mizrahi and extracting both a kind of class dimension and a race dimension in how they function at the moment, but I guess how they could work in a different way in the future. And it reminds me of a kind of a footnote in a book about Palestinians and the Mizrahi looked briefly like they might align over the Day of the Land, and the state intervened in this to convince the Mizrahi community that it was not in their best interest to kind of throw in their lot with Palestinians. And yeah, I think maybe activating that conversation again is really valuable. What I want to offer today, and I've written it down because I'm a very anxious public speaker, is kind of to invite you into my positionality a little bit, which is as a Palestinian and also as an Australian settler, and to try and think structurally about how to inhabit both of those places, and I guess to try and learn something from my Palestinian self in how I can approach my life as a settler in some ways. And I want to begin actually by talking about Christchurch, the recent massacre in Christchurch, because I think it highlights some of the prevalent and alarming trends in Australian society at the moment, and I think it's something that we need to look at structurally and ask ourselves what we can learn from the event. All of us who are not Indigenous, what we can learn from the event. So Christchurch, for me, when I think about it, highlighted something that I have to remain vigilant about in the Australian context. When I think about Israel-Palestine, I'm always conscious of the Palestinian subjectivity of inequality, of racialisation and discrimination, meted out through injustice, arrogance and violence by the state. But in Australia, for me, it's sometimes possible to feel distance from trends that I can't relate to, like the rise of white supremacy, the so-called alt-right, or the idea that being an Antifa is a bad thing to be. I imagine this must be how some Israelis feel, and I'm clear on how I feel about that position, and that is that it's a response of privilege, or maybe a response of apathy, and that it's utterly inadequate. So I think structural thinking is essential because it's often shirked, because it's much easier to hold individuals accountable rather than the societies that have produced those individuals and enabled them to tend and foster a set of violent fantasies. There's a strong preference in rotten societies to attribute a litany of evils onto a single criminal. We know this pattern, that when people from the dominant social group commit a crime, it's mitigated in politics and media and popular and public opinion, not because they're viewed as acts of the mentally ill, but because society insists, in these cases, on the responsibilisation of the individual. I think this was clear in the management of Itzhak Rabin's assassin, whose insistent political narrative in court was strenuously ignored in the 1990s. And this is also clear in the aftermath of Christchurch, because the Australian perpetrator is not sufficiently recognised as holding a program of ideas which are shared by many, even if few would act as he did. And so I feel like the crisis that we're grappling with at the moment is a refusal to acknowledge that the rationale of these killers is actually commonplace, because it's easier to focus on the exceptional actions or course of actions that they've taken. So one of my central research questions as a scholar has been, how does a society collectively formulate a position in which it's unable to acknowledge the basic rights of others? It's kind of a very simple question. And in my work on Israel-Palestine, I keep coming up against the idea that Jewish Israelis have a range of unfounded but nevertheless legitimate fears. And I mention this because I think it's the same question that we now confront in Australia, in an era of rising white supremacist groups and white entitlement. So when we see the return of Pauline Hanson or the senatorship of Fraser Anning, and now in the wake of Christchurch, we are asking in the media, and I think somewhat collectively, what are the legitimate grievances and concerns of people who articulate their problems in terms of African gains or Muslim immigration, or excluding refugees. And what's so frustrating about framing a culture of political violence through ideas of legitimate grievance or fear is that we use the idea to consider why a dominant group is using its power badly. And I think this is a question for privileged people to ask who aren't directly at risk. But in asking this question, we also ignore the actual rights of Palestinians or of Aboriginal Australians or immigrants or refugees, and we pit those rights against a set of feelings as if they have an equal weight. But in fact, not only that, we know they don't have an equal weight because so often these feelings are weighted over and above actual tangible rights of people. So in settler colonial societies particularly, I think we set up a false dialogue when we attempt to get inside the skin of why people feel aggrieved or threatened. We're propelled far away from a set of standards and rights that apply to everyone because this is inherent to the power and resource grabbing of settler colonial nations. Their success and prevalence is based on impulses to violence and a narrative of superiority which naturalises racialised inequality. This is fundamental to the legal structures and political structures. And so when we think about the punishment of Eloy Rosario, who Orly mentioned, he ends up serving 9 months in prison for shooting a Palestinian in the head. And at an approximately similar time, I had Tamimi, who is a Palestinian woman and a minor, serves 8 months for slapping a soldier on the face after her cousin is shot in the head. And so the disparity of this is obviously gross, right? But it's not the legal system in Israel failing. It's how the legal system in Israel is meant to work. Because legal systems cannot protect people that they were not designed to protect. So I think we can say, like, thinking about the relationship between race and colonialism, that they function as a pair in many ways. And I don't mean to say that one creates the other as such, but that they're a kind of powerful duo. And I think race thinking, especially in its colonial interface, has normalised a hierarchicalisation of people and also naturalised vast disparities in power and wealth and privilege and rights. And so if we're alarmed by the uneven application of the law, we need to address it structurally, because racialised violence and exclusion are not unfortunate byproducts of this system, but actually the structuring foundation of their core. This is also why I think societies expect too much from people they oppress. They expect their others to calmly educate them and to disavow violence and to constantly prove that they're human and worth a seat at the table. And society expects this, even though it is the colonised who continue to pay the costs of their colonisation. So I think it's impossible to consider questions of decolonisation without interrogating our ideas about what privilege is, and you touched on this as well, Orly, and acknowledge how we've benefited from structural privileges when we're not Aboriginal Australians in Australia or Palestinians in Israel-Palestine. But it's also important to consider that racism is actually also deployed as a neoliberal strategy, and so to touch on kind of class ideas. And it shields the profiteers of the neoliberal project from serious discussion about how structural inequality works and who it benefits and whose interests to serve by maintaining the status quo. So in working through questions of decolonisation, we need to recognise that racism does not offer salvation from the neoliberal crisis, it just promises us more of the same. And I think this also requires a conversation amongst us, and maybe amongst us today, about the value of community and valuing community over personal interests, because altruism that can reward me precisely because it rewards other people and is important in benefiting others. So I think those of us who are settlers here and elsewhere also need to actively shoulder responsibility. And I think that we often talk about responsibility, but I think we're very good at saying what a community does wrong, or why they're impossible to help, or why they're unsympathetic. And I think we need to take responsibility without indicating what the colonised community should be providing or doing better themselves, but simply to take it without a kind of right of reply in some ways. And so I think in relinquishing privilege, we need to do this with no expectation of return. And we need to recognise that the language of rights is only effective when it's inclusive, and particularly in the current paradigm, and that it's only guaranteed when it's not selective. So that's all I have to say.
Thanks for having me. I've just got some points that I guess I wanted to respond to with both Micaela and Orly's talk today, so thank you very much for having me. So I, like Micaela and Orly too, want to highlight, I guess, that how settler colonialism is a structure and that's why it's so hard to dismantle, because it's not only, it's horizontal and vertical, and it operates and produces racism and structural inequalities in those ways that are premised upon here, Indigenous dispossession, and it structures our world and all of our institutions, like the legal system, again, as well. I'm going to highlight that, like Micaela as well, because Orly spoke about two sets of laws in terms of the Israeli and Palestinian person smoking marijuana. You know, and here that operates too, right? We have one set of laws, but it's policed differently, you know. And so, you know, the Royal Commission into Aboriginal Deaths in Custody in 1991, one of the findings in that was that more Aboriginal people die in jail because of policing, because there's more Aboriginal people who are being sent into the courts and then sent to prison, right? And that at the moment is most being played out and advocated so strongly by Tanya Day's family in terms of public drunkenness, where you probably all, I assume you're all aware that, but I'll just briefly, Tanya Day is a 55-year-old woman who died in custody in Castlemaine after being removed from a train, placed in a police cell. Various failures of the system, or actual successes, but I'll get to that in a minute, where police didn't check on her, didn't call an ambulance, various health professionals didn't do their jobs properly, and as a result she passed away. Was murdered by the state, I guess. I mean, that's the way I would probably say it. And you know, through the advocacy of her family and other community behind the family, at the moment the colonial courts are considering the role of systemic racism and what role that played in the actions of the people and the people in the Tanya Day case, which is huge, I think, because it hasn't been considered before. And as Micaela said too, the legal system, I guess, is doing its job. You know, as a part, when we talk about settler colonialism being a structure, part of its structure is its police and prisons, and when it's premised upon the dispossession and the removal of Indigenous bodies or Palestinian bodies, what that means is that these institutions kill and get rid of the people that they're dispossessing, and that's, and so, it is doing its job. So that's why reformism doesn't work. We can't make these places better, and we can't fix them because they're broken to begin with, or so we need to fight against them, I guess. And what else was I going to say? The other thing I wanted to say is that the way settler colonialism, I believe, works as well is that it sets different groups up against each other and makes us hate each other and hate ourselves. And a part of the strength, I think, of settler colonialism is that it shifts and changes, you know, and its manoeuvrability and its adaptability is a part of its strength, you know, and that's why we see different changes in who we're supposed to hate or that sort of thing. So one of the most powerful things I think that we can do is to continually be conscious of that and then also turn up and show up and build alliances with each other to work to dismantle these structures, both internationally and locally. And, you know, if we're working in Kulin country, then we need to centre Indigenous sovereignties, and in that way we also unmask, I think, settler colonialism by continually centering and centering Indigenous sovereignties and cultures of the places that we're at. We are kind of we're trying to circumvent, I think, settler colonialism by continuing to name and not forget what we're here for and whose bodies and lives are sacrificed for us to be in this place. and then to make sure that we're fighting in order for Indigenous futures, I guess. So thank you. I'm keen to hear what people think.
I'm going to do a bit of the same, just read out a couple of things that came to mind from everyone having spoken. But before I do, I'm going to say that I'm neither Palestinian nor Indigenous. I'm Lebanese and initially from Sydney. And my parents come from an area in Lebanon called Tripoli. So there was like heaps of stuff that came to mind. I jotted them down, they might not be in order. And I kind of like, so I'm a filmmaker, and a lot of the time, mainly we used to make things up. Initially I started making films to entertain me and my cousins. And then, you know, the whole idea of, I'm also a Muslim, so the idea of da'wah, or like, you know, preaching to Islam, to the non-Muslims, because it's, you know, your responsibility to make sure they know we're not terrorists, you know, like, that came into play in a lot of the stories that I started to tell. And then I pivoted back and I was like, actually, no, I do not want to actually be talking to white people. I want to be talking to my community about what we need to do to make ourselves stronger so that we can, I don't know, hold each other and like make sure that we center justice and support First Nations people. So the idea of model minority is something that I grew up in, right? So like you grow up as a Muslim, especially in Western Sydney, you know the government is always looking for, you know, someone to be their tokens, and you need to be very careful because, you know, that's your career path, right? And I've seen it happen to person after person after person, like at least 5-6 people who slowly, you know, are always at the front of the paper and who get thrown out everywhere, and then the minute that they actually say what they think or stuff up or whatever it is, then there goes their careers, there goes their lives, there goes their families. They're like, you know, to go see, they have to. And this notion of, you know, model minority, it comes from the idea, like, you know, it's rooted in this idea of da'wah as well, right? Of this, like, it's our responsibility to also, you know, explain what Islam is about and, you know, make sure everyone becomes Muslim so that you get saved in a way. You know, joking, like. But yeah, then I came across, or I didn't come across, I have a really good friend whose name is Eugenia Flynn, and I generally follow her everywhere I go. I write down because she says it. And she, at one of her talks, mentioned the notion of foundational racism and the idea that this entire country was established through the exclusion of the people who own the lands. And so that means that, you know, they came here and they said, no, you don't get this, and you don't, so First Nations folks, you can't do this, and you can't, and they did that through actual institutions, yeah? So, and again, like, this is probably really basic for a lot of you guys, but this is all I've got to give you, so, and so then these exact same systems, these health systems, these education systems, were then, you know, made into institutions, Department of Education, Department of Health, blah, 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 and those same systems are now used to oppress us. But we are both the oppressor and the oppressed. And so we need to really start to think about, right, so what do we do when you're two sides of that coin? And so that comes down to centering First Nations resistance, right? It comes down to being like, okay, first shut up and listen, right? Like, learn, educate yourself, read, show up, all of that type of thing. And I guess that for me connected with what you were saying around the walls. And that Muslims need to be, and Arabs in general in this country need to be conscious of sovereignty and resistance. and how we put our bodies and our money and our voices in spaces, or we don't, so that this system that is oppressing us, because it was actually made to oppress First Nation folk, can get something happens with it. I don't know exactly. And you know, a perfect example is the Tanya Day campaign and what's happening to me still with, or what happened to me still with. So like, you know, Arabs and Muslims are imprisoned as well, right? I know so many people that have been in and out of the prison systems for multiple reasons, but they all end up coming out of prison. I don't know a single person that has died in prison.
Yeah.
But that reality is the standard for First Nation folk. So even if like, yeah. And you know, more recently there was a drought. I can't remember where, somewhere. But the Muslim community decided to, we're going to get together, we're going to do something. And I don't want to say that the Muslim community is like doing bad things, or like the Arab community. And you know, obviously it's not interchangeable, Muslim and Arab, and you know, and like anything I say that is in any way wrong, like comes from me, and I apologise in advance. This is very much stuff that I'm learning as I'm going, so I'm just, yeah. But so they came together around droughts, and they went to the farms that were owned by white people and did a prayer for rain and things like that. But Jabberong here in Victoria has been happening, and you know, I'm part of a group that we went to Jabberong to try and hold Friday sermons there. So the guy at Christchurch, he went into the mosque and shot everyone up in. So we wanted to hold the sermon that would have happened in the mosque on Jabberong. And if you don't know, the Jabberong is up near Ararat, and there's all of these like really old sacred trees, and the government just wants to bulldoze this entire land that has such significant cultural significance to First Nations people, to the Jabberong people, and we struggled to get Muslims to come up to Ararat. We did everything we could. We carpool, tried to explain the purpose, the importance, you know, to come up there, that we were throwing out verses from the Quran about justice, about standing with the oppressed, about this and that, you know, and really the only people that showed up were the crew that we, like us. And what's her name came as well? I can't remember her name now. She was like someone that came from overseas. Yeah, but you know, and you know, there was the other thing around the billboard in Melbourne, where it was Australian. Yeah, that one. Yeah, that. Yeah.
Nora Erica.
Yeah. So yeah, and the last thing I want to say is the billboard, right? So Australia Day happened, or happens all the time, Invasion Day. And they had this massive billboard with like these two Muslim young girls in Australian flag hijabs that then got taken down by someone because it was like, oh, you know, F the Muslims, we don't want them. And then the Muslims went and rallied and put money together to put the billboard back up. and it was just like, everyone was saying, do not do that, like that's not what you need to be doing. But the Muslims are like, no, this is what we're going to do, right? Because it comes back to the idea of this model minority, which is what is, you know. Yeah, exactly. How can you prove that you're not the terrorist, right? How can you, yeah, but you prove you're not the terrorist by standing with First Nations folk and standing for, you know, justice and, yeah.
Yeah, great.
Thank you all so much. I just feel really honoured to have heard all of four of you speak. I don't know about everybody else in the audience, but that feels like a really profound panel. And I'm very moved and inspired by all of you. So thank you all very much. I think that's a kind of a great place for us to start a discussion of you prove you're not the terrorist by standing with Aboriginal people. And I guess, yeah, part of, we all kind of talked about, and this morning when I was talking with Crystal about this panel, and not to venture really close to Crystal, but she said something about settler colonialism makes us hate ourselves and hate each other. Is that right, Crystal? Yeah. And I think that it kind of encapsulates, those two things, I think encapsulate what you were all talking about, and I guess what we're all kind of here thinking about. And I guess I kind of wondered if we could think a bit more together about how do we have that kind of solidarity? What are some ways that you've done it? Because you all talked really so beautifully about how necessary it is, and there were some kind of general ideas about it, but I also kind of wondered maybe what are moments of, so the jumper on trees, sorry, I'm going to interrupt myself and say, what I also meant to say is that we have the petition for to support Tanya Day's family, to call for the removal of public drunkenness as a crime, which is a big campaign that's running. So one of the recommendations of the Royal Commission was that public drunkenness no longer be a criminal act, and Victoria is the only state that hasn't removed it as a crime. Queensland's the other one, I apologise. So we have the petition up the back, so on your way out, please make sure you sign it. And yeah, and circulate that. Yeah.
You can get it as well online because they're going to be launching it in the next couple of weeks. So if you can get your friends and family to sign it as well, that would be great. Yeah. If anyone wants the copy and can't find it, they can contact Jordy.
Yeah. That's true. So I guess that's one concrete thing, but signing petitions, and some of us were at a rally before outside the State Library. But what else could we be doing? What are things that you've done? What are ways of making this kind of solidarity and not being a terrorist concrete?
Well, for me, the first thing was to learn Arabic. Really, I mean, it's absurd how few people in Israel, from the Jewish Israelis, actually speak Arabic. I mean, we all speak more or less fairly decent English. I mean, you can come to Israel and you will get by very easily with only speaking English. But less than 2% of the Israeli Jewish society speak Arabic. Now, this is not just an act of solidarity, it's mostly for me an act of trying not to be stupid. Because if I'm fed only by the Israeli Hebrew-speaking media, it's not that I know only part of the facts. I don't know the facts because they are being told in a very, very twisted and manipulative way. So I studied Arabic, and so now I can read Arabic newspapers and listen to Arabic radio and actually speak with Palestinians in their own language and understand what's going on. So solidarity for me is knowledge, first of all. I mean, you really need to learn the fact, and you will need to make an effort to be able to obtain the facts. And one other thing that I will mention is we always in the activist community very much like to speak about this slogan, acknowledge our privileges. But then it's a nice slogan, but what does it actually mean? It means that you are me, as an Israeli Jew, I'm able to do things that my Palestinian friends will be arrested for doing the exact same things. And I am aware of the fact that articles that I write, things that I say publicly, very few of my friends, certainly not Palestinians from the occupied territories, but even Palestinian Israeli citizens, I know of, take Darinta Tour, for example. I don't know if you heard about her. She's a young poet, a Palestinian Israeli citizen, Palestinian citizen of Israel, who posted a very minor poem that its title was Resist My People or something like that. 3 years of her life was taken, I mean, part of it in house arrest, the other in jail actually, for writing resist. I can say resist and nothing will happen to me. So I will say that. So to understand what these privileges allow you and to push it to the limit as far as you can. That's what I said with that.
So yeah, definitely education. I think, you know, in Australia, so-called Australia, you know, it's about centering black media, yeah? So NITV, start watching it. There's a podcast called Let's Talk, 98.9 FM, you know? Start listening to that. So that's, you need to start to, yeah, we all need to start to actually listen. And then it's also about recognizing, I think it's something that I constantly try to remember, is like, in Islam it's this sense of the nafs, or the ego, and the idea of like, what happens when you put yourself forward, you know, like you start to get full of yourself, you start to think, oh, I'm the bomb, you know, so you're like, you know, I'm doing this great thing, you know, like I'm helping First Nations folk, but I'm a warrior, like, you know, and so it's about oppressing that, right, or making sure you squash your nafs or your ego, and then I'm not, you'll learn, like you'll be told, do this, don't do this, just do as you're like, you know, listen and do as you're told, and that's maybe like, that's how I've started really, and then just be open to, that's the other thing, you're gonna fuck up, because you're gonna like get it wrong, right, and you need to own it when you get it wrong, and not take up too much space with the fact that you have gotten it wrong, be like, sorry, I'm gonna check that.
I'll add a concrete thing. I think also one of the things that's going on at the moment now in Victoria is treaty, right? And there is loads out there coming from people on social media, just follow the hashtags about opinions about treaty. But one of the things is that the treaty, I think people see it as Indigenous business, but it's not, it's everyone's business. And the state is entering into an agreement on your behalf if you're not Indigenous here, you know? So what do you want in it? Like, you can help advocate for what Indigenous people want, you know? If you want this to be a meeting of laws that then set the foundations for how people move forward, or how, you know, Indigenous people in the state move forward together, what Indigenous people want, you know, you can tell your local MPs, tell your government what it is you want in those things, you know. And that's a really, it's not Indigenous business, it's everyone. So and 6:30, then talking about listening to Indigenous voices, 6:30 on Sunday night on NITV are some films that have been put out and created through, I think maybe Creative Victoria, but anyway, from local Victorian Indigenous people. Film Victoria, there you go, that's nice. I know Tanine and Onus Williams and Paul Gorey are two people who have made one of the films, and I think there's some others who are you know, and you can watch those films and hear what they have to say about treaty that's happening in Victoria. I'm not actually from here, I'm from Western Australia, and you know, that's also a part of me living here on this place is that I'm a visitor here, and a part of what I see my kind of sovereign responsibilities, my responsibilities as a person living in this country, is to centre the fights of local people, you know, not listen to what's going on in a similar way to all of you, and make sure that you use your power in ways that centre Indigenous sovereignties and the sovereignties of where you actually are. So.
I feel like Fats has actually brought up a few things that I probably would have talked about, and also Crystal, but again, like going back to thinking about what happens for me in a Israel-Palestine context and in an Australian context. Some years ago, there was a group that was going to donate some money to Palestinians, but to be spent and used in a way that they were not happy with them, which broke their kind of BDS, I guess, relationship. And as I heard the story, the Israelis got very frustrated that they wouldn't accept the money, and they were like, well, you know, you're not taking the help that we're offering you, so you're an impossible bunch. And so I guess thinking about that as well in the Australian context, and actually listening to what people are asking for rather than coming in as a kind of saviour, seems to be really important. Yeah, the other thing that Fats mentioned, which I can really relate to too, so my family were refugees from 1948, and I feel like they probably didn't engage much with what was going on in Australia for a long time, and I think it's because they were grieving and because they had really different problems to deal with, but they also didn't see themselves as having a history of violence, I guess, with Australian Aboriginal people, because they felt that they'd come after everything had happened. And of course we now think about these things in different ways, and so if we had to think about the, as Crystal said, the sort of verticality and horizontality and ongoing nature of settler colonialism, I think people who perhaps felt that they didn't have a stake in what goes on in this country because they were latecomers need to reevaluate that. And I don't think they're a hard group to convince in some ways. I feel like the parallelisms are quite easy for the Arab and the Muslim community to understand. And you know, there's a sense of wanting to belong, I think, when you come from a refugee community, but there's not one way that belonging looks like. So when I was a kid, my father was the only person I knew who said in a serious way, as opposed to a kind of wry or sort of, you know, ironic way. He would introduce himself and he'd begin with "G'day," and I went to a private girls' school and it was quite humiliating. You sort of go into this very fancy environment, right, and says "G'day." But to me, that's also actually quite symbolic of the idea of wanting to belong, and yet kind of misapprehending the environment in which he was trying to forge an alliance with and trying to belong in. And I think that in talking to my father, who's quite thoughtful now about the comparisons in the Palestinian context and the Aboriginal Australian context, it's not a hard sell, and I think offering people other modes of belonging is actually something we should be working towards.
Did any of you have any questions that you want to ask each other? Is anything okay. Maybe what we'll do now is we'll take 5 minutes, turn to the person next to you. If you're workshop a question that you have, turn to the person next to you and see what you're thinking. And then we'll come back together in 5 minutes once you've all formulated your brilliant, incisive, moving question.